In this tutorial, I'm going to teach you how to take ChatGPT, which is a brand new cutting-edge AI tool, and integrate it into a React application. Now, the possibilities with this technology are virtually endless, but in this tutorial, we're going to create a blurb maker. So we're going to enter in a random combination of keywords, and then we're going to hit this create blurb button, and then we're going to call upon ChatGPT to spontaneously generate a unique blurb for a fictional story. So just to demonstrate how that works, we can write in, let's just say, horse, orange juice, we can say tram, and something else random. We'll say a purple tiger. So a random combination of keywords, we hit create blurb, and then in a matter of seconds, ChatGPT is going to generate a completely unique blurb for a completely fictional story. And you can read that right down there. It's amazing what this technology can do, and I'm going to teach you how to harness it step by step. Before we get into the content, I just want to quickly explain what ChatGPT actually is for those who don't know. This is an amazing tool which is designed by an organization called OpenAI, and I'm here in the official ChatGPT interface, which anyone can access for free. All you've got to do is sign up for an account. And this is amazing because you can enter in any text-based input that you want, and the tool is going to respond in a very human-like, very sophisticated manner. So you can enter in virtually anything. I'm going to say, for example, write a brief essay on the history of helicopters. And in a matter of seconds, it's going to start replying, and as you can see, the response is so almost indistinguishable from a human. And really, really informative as well. So it's an amazing tool, and it's one thing to interact with it through the official interface like I am now, but I'm going to teach you how you can actually utilize OpenAI's API and then plug this amazing technology directly into your application. There is a little bit of prerequisite knowledge required for this tutorial. You don't need to be an expert in React by any means, but if you've got a fundamental understanding of like hooks and HTML and CSS and functions and event handlers, just that basic stuff, that's really going to help you follow along. As you can see, I haven't started with a completely blank slate. I've got this basic application open here in my browser. Just this basic HTML, which you can see down here. There's no functionality or styling applied to it yet. We're going to do that all in a moment. And then in my source folder over here, there's only 4 files. So I've got the app.js, which you can see here, this app.css, which is completely empty. The index.js is more or less how it was automatically initialized. The only difference is that there's no report web vitals down there, because that's not really necessary for this tutorial. And then what else? The index CSS, I haven't even touched that. So that's pretty much what we're starting with. Just in terms of the broad overview of this tutorial, I'm going to run through the content twice. So the first time it's going to be very quick, very concise. I'm going to fast forward through a lot of it. There'll be minimal explanation. The idea of that first demo is just so you can see me writing the code and follow along. And then once everything's in place and the application's actually working, I'm going to go back a second time and explain everything that I've done and why, so that you understand step by step what we're actually doing. So that's the broad overview, and this is the method that we're going to be following up here. And each step takes 2 or 3 minutes, so I'm just going to launch straight into it. You can follow along, and hopefully we get to the same destination at the end. For the first step, we need to sign up for OpenAI. Now, this is a very straightforward thing to do. You just go to this URL here, openai.com/API, hit this sign up button in the top corner, and from there, it's just the same process you've done 1,000 times before. You just give them an email, password, they'll send a code to either your phone or your email so you can authenticate yourself, and then just like that, you'll have your own account. It's completely free, you don't need to pay any money. So I don't really need to walk you through that aspect of this process, just because it is very simple and straightforward. But what I will do is I'll take you to my own account, which is already open here. And I do want to show you how to create your own secret API key, because this is an essential part of the process. So I'm going to go here to this tab up the top. I'm going to go view API keys. And basically, we need to generate our own unique key so that we can actually work with the OpenAI API. Now, if that doesn't make too much sense to you right now, it's okay. Don't stress. We'll come back to this later. The point is basically you just press this button down here. That'll automatically generate your own API key, and then you can just take that and copy and paste it into your own application. So I've already done that. You can see up the top here, I've got my own secret key. This is actually very sensitive, this key. I don't mind you seeing it for the purposes of this tutorial, because I'm actually going to delete this key before I publish the tutorial. But if you ever do make a public-facing application, you want to make sure you keep this secret, because if you don't, other people could potentially get access to your key and then they could make queries against your account, and that could actually end up costing you money. So in terms of how to keep that secret, that's kind of beyond the scope of this tutorial, but just for the purposes of this one, we're going to use this up here. I'm going to just leave that so you can see it, and then I'm going to copy and paste it into the application later on. Step 2 is our imports and installations. There are 2 modules that we need for this project. So I'm going to open up my terminal down here. I'm going to stop the server momentarily, and I'm going to say npm install Axios and OpenAI. So these are the 2 modules that we need to import. That should only take a few seconds to run through. Once that's done, I'm going to say npm start to restart the server. Close this terminal back down. And then I do need to import a couple of things. So up here I'm going to say import. What do we need to do? We need to import Axios from Axios, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. And then we need to import configuration and OpenAI API. And that's from the OpenAI library. So there we are. We've got that imported and installed. That's step 2 done. Step 3 is our styling. Now, as you can see, I've already got this HTML stuff written down here. Feel free if you want to take a moment to pause the video and just copy this out word for word, including the class names, because what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go into the app.css file and I'm just going to write out the CSS code that corresponds to these class names. So hopefully you're able to follow along with that. If you don't understand what each and every line of this code does, that's fine at the moment. The point is just to get it down, get your application looking the same as mine if you are following along, and then we can come back and revisit what this stuff actually does later on in the tutorial. But for now, we're just going to jump back into our app.js and get on to step 4. So I've initialized those 4 state variables. It's thrown an error, and the reason for that is because we haven't imported our useState hook. So I'm going to come up here and do that, import useState, and the next step requires the useRef hook. So I'm going to import that as well, hit save, and then the error goes away. So now step 5, link input to the input ref, handle onChange event. So here we're going to go above our state variables. We're going to say const input ref equals useRef, just like that. And then we're going to come down here to our input, which is this one here with the class name of input field. And we're going to say ref equals input ref. So that reference variable we just created, we're linking that to our input. And the reason why we're doing that will become evident later in the tutorial. And there is one other thing we need to do here as well. We need to handle an onChange event. So again, if you're not familiar with this, it doesn't matter just yet. But basically, we're going to say onChange equals E for event. And then down here, we're going to say set... Sorry, I need to refer to my notes. Set current keyword set current keyword to e.target.value, just like that. So step 6, we're creating a modify keywords function. I'm just going to fast forward through this as well. Basically, it's just a function called modify keywords. It takes one parameter or one argument, and we're going to then link it to a couple of event handlers. One thing to remember, make sure when you've got this set prompt line here, just make sure there is a space between the brackets, between the $ here and the little, whatever you want to call that thing. I don't know the terminology for it, but just make sure that space is in there because that's actually important. And so now we're just going to go down and add 2 event handlers, one to the submit keyword button and one to the reset button. Okay, so that's step 6 done. We're actually pretty close to having a functioning app here. At the moment, it doesn't appear to be functioning. If I come in here and type in a random keyword and say like submit keyword, it's not appearing down the bottom. It's just kind of disappearing. That's perfectly okay. It's just because there's another step that we need to add into the process. But we'll come back to that in just a moment. For now, we got step 7, which is create send prompt. And this is actually the function which is going to interact with the API. So just to make a quick point, I'm now going to add my secret key into the authorization field of this query. I'm going to obviously use I'm going to use my own key, which we've saved up here, but I just wanted to make the point just to avoid any confusion. This has got to be your key. So whatever your key is, which you generated over here by hitting create new secret key, come down here and then just paste it in exactly the same way that I'm pasting mine. Once you've got that all written out, just come down here. There is one final step. We need to come underneath here, and we need to say set completion, and we need to set it to this very confusing looking variable, but it will all make sense in time. We're going to say response.data.choices0.text. So I know that seems like a lot, but don't stress about it right now. Okay, and we are very, very close. So now step 8. We're going to finalize the component rendering. So there's just 2 more things we need to do, and then believe it or not, we'll all be done. So I'm going to come down here. First thing I need to do is come into this keywords wrapper, and I'm going to basically map the keywords array. So I'm going to say keywords.map. If you've worked with mapping before, you might have encountered something like this. We're going to say return h4. The key of h4 is going to be equal to the index variable, and then inside of that we're going to say L. Okay, if you haven't mapped stuff before, don't stress about it. And then we're going to come down here to the output, and we're going to do some conditional rendering. So we're going to say if completion equals loading, we're going to return a paragraph tag that has the text awaiting response, just like that. And doesn't like that because I haven't put a null. So we're saying and otherwise, if that condition isn't met, we're going to say P, and we're just going to fill that in with the completion variable. All right, so that's done. We've got our components rendered, and we are ready to test this out. So I'm going to come up here. What keyword should I put in? I'm going to say paper, and I'm going to say chainsaw, and I'm going to say What else can we do? Let's do dolphins. I'm going to say a group of dolphins, actually, just to make it interesting. Submit keywords. So as you can see, now that we've added in that rendering, the keywords, as we submit them, they're actually appearing down here. And if I go create blurb, and this is where the magic happens, we hit create blurb, and I just realized it's not going to work. And the reason it's not going to work is we need one last event handler. So when we come here to the create blurb button, I'm just building suspense at this point. I'm just going to say send prompt. So when this button's clicked, we're going to run this function up here. And now let's try again. We'll refresh. We'll do some more stuff. This time we'll say cardboard, broken bottle, and we're not going to have a group of dolphins. We're going to have a group of hyenas. Submit keyword, and now I think this should work. So we hit create blurb. It's saying awaiting response, and there you go. So just like that, we've got all the code we need in order to have a functioning React application that harnesses the power of OpenAI, or ChatGPT more specifically. So I'm now going to go back and review the content. We're going to take it step by step. There was one last step of the process. If response isn't correctly formatted, create passing function. I put that in because when I first started demonstrating this, the response was coming back weirdly formatted. There was a line break in there, and it was kind of making it look a bit ugly. So I did actually write a function which made it more presentable. But for some reason, between testing this out and actually running it now, it doesn't seem to be doing that anymore. So I don't know if OpenAI has made a quick fix, or I don't know really what the reason for it is, but basically this is not necessary anymore. So I'm just going to leave that there. We're not going to do it. Maybe at the end as a bonus, I'll write that in case you do need to do it. But for now, we're just going to leave that, and we're going to jump into the slow and steady review of all the concepts at play. Welcome back. Or really, you should be welcoming me back. If you look at the top right corner of the screen, you'll see that it is currently Wednesday, the 11th of January. When I did the walkthrough that you just finished watching, it was yesterday, Tuesday, the 10th of January. And the reason for that is because I went to sleep. There's many benefits to being human as opposed to being an AI. Some of those benefits are you get to go on roller coasters, you get to fall in love, you get to eat delicious food. But one of the downsides is that you do get sleepy. And that's what happened yesterday. So anyway, went to bed, woke up, and now I'm going to do the review today. One thing I also did want to address before we get too far into it is I made a mistake when I did the walkthrough. And that was, so this step 2, imports and installations. One of the packages we installed, this OpenAI package, is completely unnecessary. We don't even use it at all in the entire project. The reason I put that in there is when I was first planning this tutorial, I was kind of following step by step the OpenAI's documentation. And importing this package was one of those steps, but it wasn't necessary for what I was doing. And then I forgot to take it out of my notes, and I just kind of did it. But by all means, you can just take that straight out because that's not necessary at all. You could even uninstall that entire OpenAI package. So apologies if that caused any confusion. So just in terms of a broad overview of what we've done here, before we get into the weeds, as you can probably or maybe already tell, this whole project revolves around this function here. So this send prompt function, within that we're running a HTTP request to this API endpoint, and then provided we've done everything correctly, provided we've sent the right parameters and we've authorized ourselves, we're getting back a response object here, and that response object contains the data that we're then displaying down here. And that communication is being enabled by Axios, which is this, I've got the documentation up here. It's a promise-based HTTP client. So basically what it does is we can import Axios into our browser or into like a Node.js file, and then we can use that as kind of a means of communicating with any API endpoint. So it's a really helpful tool. I use it all the time when I'm making HTTP requests, but we're going to, again, touch on that in a moment. So step 1, sign up for OpenAI. We don't really need to go into that. Hopefully that was a pretty straightforward process. Step 2, the imports and installations. Like I said, I stuffed up. Half of that was not even necessary. But aside from my mistake, that is hopefully, again, pretty straightforward. Step 3, the styling. We don't need to probably spend too much time on this. Hopefully you've had a little bit of experience with CSS before. In essence, what we're doing is every element has a class name. So the parent element here is app, and then we've got child elements beneath that of header, input, and output. And then there are some elements nested within that as well. So keywords wrapper, button wrapper, and input field. And so then we're using those class name selectors here inside of our CSS file to just apply some relatively basic styling. So we're just setting the height and the width. I've used view height units and view width elements for the most part. And then everything that needs to be kind of like stretched out and evenly spaced, I've given it a display style of flex. So we're turning those divs into like a flex container. And then I guess the only other styling thing that I'd probably want to touch on is this keywords wrapper. I've given it an overflow of auto. So I've defined the width and I've given it overflow of auto. And that doesn't appear to do anything right now because we're not overflowing its width parameter. But if I just say, if I just put in a bunch of keywords and then what's a really big word? Supercalifragilistic, blah, 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 blah. You know, just a really long word. And then as you'll see, once we overlap that 96 view width, then suddenly we have this scroll bar here, which enables us to like scroll through. That's not a hugely important part of this because you're probably not going to have a huge amount of keywords, but if you're working on a narrow screen like we are now, it's important to have that there, because if you don't have that there and then you have a bunch of keywords, then it kind of just like drifts off the screen and it makes for a really poor user experience. So that's just the purpose of that overflow. That's the purpose of that overflow definition there. And remember, I did mention the importance of keeping this secret key secret. I might have confused you slightly because I said on the one hand that having an OpenAI account is free, and on the other hand, by not keeping your key secret, you could make yourself potentially vulnerable to other people running up expenses on your account. And I understand that that seems like a bit of a contradiction. Basically, when you sign up for an OpenAI account, you get $18 of free credit. And so you can run a whole bunch of queries, and until you use up that $18 quota, you don't pay a single cent. And then beyond that, you need to provide like payment details, and that's when you start paying. So although it's free to use OpenAI, and although by using this project it won't cost you a cent, there is the potential that were somebody to get their hands on your secret key, then they could start making requests with your key, and then they could use up your whole $18 quota, and then you would be required to start paying money in order to utilize the API. So that's what I meant when I said that it could end up costing you money. The bottom line is that if you are going to use this for a commercial purpose or for any purpose that that is going to be visible to the public, then you do want to keep that secret. In terms of like how to keep it secret in practice, like I said, that's beyond the scope of this tutorial. I don't have time to explain it now, but basically what we would do is we would have a second server, and we would store that key in what's called an environment variable. And then when we authorize our request, we would use that environment variable in the authorization field. And then that's how we could get away with like inserting that string into the request without it ever actually being visible to anybody. So now let's get into the meat. What's actually going on here under the hood to make all of this possible? Now, you'll remember we initialized 4 state variables. We got keywords, which is initialized as an empty array, current keyword, which is initialized as an empty string, prompt, which is initialized as this string here, the write a blurb of a novel that includes the following terms, and completion, which is also initialized as an empty string. So I'm going to walk through these one by one and explain how they explain their relationship to these different elements up here. So basically, I'll start with the current keyword variable. This current keyword updates every time we enter something into the input field. So if we come down here to this element, you'll see that on change, every time something occurs within this input field, we're setting the value of the current keyword to e.target.value. And e.target.value means event. So there's been an event inside this input field. Target, like what is the element that's been targeted by that event, and then the value of the input field. So to demonstrate that, I've got this console log line here. And I'm saying current keyword equals the value of the current keyword. So now if I open this up and go into my console, I'll be able to demonstrate this. So if I type in anything, if I type in elephant, notice what's going on in the console. Every time something occurs inside of this input field, the current keyword is being updated. And you'll notice it's lagging one step behind. That's just got to do with the way that React renders. Things don't happen necessarily in order. Some processes take a few milliseconds longer than others, and as a result, it's not reflected in this current keyword. Don't stress about that right now. There are situations in React programming where you're going to need to like understand why that's happening and how to prevent it. But just for demonstration purposes, it's just lagging one step behind. So now when I backspace the T, you'll see it now equals elephant, and as I backspace in the other way, it's responding accordingly. So that's basically what's happening there. Every time we do something inside of this input field, we're updating that current keyword variable. But then that begs the question, what are we doing with that current keyword variable? Well, what we're basically doing is we're inserting it into the keywords array. So that's the second state variable that we're working with. How are we inserting it into the keywords array? Well, we're doing it with this modify keywords function here, and we're calling that modify keywords function in two ways, either by hitting the submit keyword button or the reset button. So if we come down here, you'll see we've got these two buttons, both of them on click run this modify keywords function, but when we click the submit keyword, we're running it with an argument of push, and when we click the reset button, we're running it with an argument of clear. So we come up here to this modify keywords function. That push or clear is received by this input parameter. So this is just a generic variable which refers to either push or clear depending on which button we've pressed. And then we're running this code here if we've hit the submit keyword button, and we're running this code here if we've hit the reset button. And then there's two lines of code up here that we run regardless of which button's been pressed. So the first one here says input ref.current.value equals empty string. What we're doing there is we're basically setting this the value of this input field back to 0. So when I type in something and I hit one of the buttons, it goes back empty again. And that's because of this line of code here. Input ref is this reference variable, and we've assigned that to the input field. So here where we say ref equals input ref, basically what we're doing is we're linking that variable to this element here, and that enables us to then come up here, say input ref.current.value equals that, and then that's going to clear that element there. And then set current keyword. You remember as we type things, current keywords constantly updating. We want that to reflect what is inside of the input field, so we also need to set that back to an empty string whenever one of these buttons has been pressed. So what happens when we hit this submit keyword button? The first thing we're doing is we're pushing the value of the current keyword into the keywords array. So by default, keywords is equal to an empty array. There's nothing inside of it. But when we hit submit keyword button, we're taking whatever text is inside here and we're pushing that into the keywords array. But you'll notice we're doing it a little bit differently. A lot of the time with normal JavaScript programming, if we want to push an element into an array, we would just do something like this, keywords.push current keyword, and that would work perfectly fine. But the reason we can't do it in React is because we're working with a state variable, and state variables are synchronized with other components, and everything needs to remain in sync. So if we were to just do that, suddenly the keywords variable would be out of sync with the other components. So it's just a feature of React that anytime you're updating a React variable, you sometimes need to do things certain ways. So in this case, we're running this set keywords function, and we're using what's called a spread operator. So this ... keywords is basically saying whatever is already in keywords plus current keyword. And that's just a way of updating an array as a state variable. I need to explain the second thing we're doing here, which is we're updating the prompt variable. Now this one might be a little bit confusing if you haven't worked with this kind of syntax before, but in essence what's happening is relatively simple. You'll remember set prompt by default is equal to this string here. Write a blurb of a novel that includes the following terms. So what we're doing here is we're saying take what prompt already equals. In effect, we're doing something similar to what we're doing here. We're taking the existing value of the variable and we're appending something to it. So in this case we're saying take the existing state and transform it into the existing state plus this variable here. So the existing state is that string, write a blurb of a novel, blah, blah, blah. And we're just tacking on the end of it the current keyword. So if we say, I'm using a lot of African animals here. So if current value now equals hippo, and we're going to hit this submit keyword button, what we've basically done is we've come up here, we've added a space, and so that now is what that prompt variable is equal to. When we hit that button, so when we run the modify keywords function with an argument of clear, we're doing those two lines of code, and then we're also emptying the keywords array, so we're resetting it back to an empty variable, and we're resetting the prompt state back to its initial state as well. So we're resetting it back to this string with nothing on the end of it. And so that's basically what's happening with those two buttons there. So one other thing with regard to the arrays, the keywords array, how are we actually getting it to display down here? So there's a div down here that you can't currently see, but it's got a class name of keywords wrapper, and it's what contains these elements. So as the array gets updated, these will fill up, this div here will fill up with the elements. So what are we actually doing here? we're using this map method, and what it does is it basically creates a loop, and for every iteration of that loop, it's returning a particular component. So we're saying for every element of the keywords array, we're going to return a H4, and the H4 is going to display the value of that element. So for example, if we've got a keywords array that has Harry, Ron, and Hermione, 3 elements, we're looping through that. And on the first go, we're returning a H4 saying Harry. The second time, we're returning one saying Ron. The second one, we're returning one saying Hermione. And this key thing here, this is just because React likes you to have a unique identifier, a unique key for every component. And there are reasons for that. I won't go into them today. And to be honest, like for a simple task like this, it's not really necessary. It won't throw an error if you don't do it, but it will flash this warning at you. So just to avoid that, I've set the key equal to I, and I is just equal to the index. So for example, on the first iteration of this loop, I is equal to 0, and then 1, and then 2. So we're returning those elements into this field down here. So using the Harry, Ron, Hermione, so I say Harry, I say Ron, I say Hermione. And so every time that keywords array is updating, the update is being reflected down here. Because this is a state variable, every time it updates, this will also re-render automatically. So we don't need to programmatically do that. If we were just doing this in plain old HTML and JavaScript, we would actually need to write a line of code that instructs that to update. But in this case, we don't need to do that. It just does it automatically. And that's one of the really cool things about React. And that's basically the essence of state variables. That's why when we come up here, we can't just do .push. We have to update it using this set keywords function. And so that leaves us with one last thing to explore, and it's actually this is where the magic happens. And this is going to take a little bit of explanation, especially if you've never worked with HTTP requests before. Remember we said a HTTP request is basically a way for a client to communicate with a server. So in this case, we're the client, OpenAI is the server, and in order to access their technology, we need to send a query to this URL, also known as an API endpoint, and we need to satisfy certain conditions. So we need to send certain parameters inside the body, certain instructions that we need to give it in order to get a valid response. And we also need to authorize ourselves as an authorized user using our secret key. So we can come to this page here. So if you go into your account, you go documentation, you come down here to API reference. This is going to walk you through how to interact with their API and what do you need to do in order to send a valid request. So here's the authentication section. This is how we know how to authorize ourselves using the key and using the authorization field. What I want to show you is this particular section here, completions. So the endpoint that we're querying, we're sending a post request, and that's important too. It's got to be a post request to this API endpoint. So you'll see, when we go down here, that URL there is the URL that I just highlighted. So we send them a prompt, and then OpenAI's ChatGPT tool will return what's called a completion, or what they call a completion. So the request body is what goes in here. This model, prompt, max tokens, these are all fields within the request body. And we know that those fields exist because here in the documentation, it tells you all the different things that you can send, all the different ways that you can customize your request. So in our case, we're only doing model, prompt, and max tokens. So the model is the ID of the model that we're using. There are actually multiple different models. Text DaVinci 003 at the moment is the best one, and that's the one that I've used for this example. We're not going to go through all the different models now, but you can access that information like up here, for example. Here we go. So this is the one we're using, Text DaVinci 003. Like it says, it's the most capable one. It's the most powerful one. And it's been trained on data up until June 2021. And then there's these other ones as well. They're also very powerful, but they're not quite as good. They have a lower request limit, and they're not as up to date either. And you can see like it's got that description there. In what situations might you want to use something that isn't Text DaVinci 003? When you've exhausted your $18 of free credit with your OpenAI account, and if you want to do this in a commercial scale where you're running like hundreds of requests a day, you might want to utilize one of these because they're actually much lower cost. And I think if I click this here, Yeah, so here we go here. So here are the different language models. This actually tells you the cost per 1,000 tokens of each individual model that you can utilize. So as you can see, DaVinci is the one we're using, but it's actually the most expensive. And it's not hugely expensive. It's only 2 cents for every 1,000 tokens. But if you're going to be doing this on a massive scale, you might want to consider using one of these other models here, which are not as powerful, but they are significantly cheaper. And so that's the purpose of the model field. The prompt field is the most important field of all, even though it's not required. So you'll see there's no required flag for the prompt field. But the reason is if you don't send anything in the prompt field, then it's just going to default to this meaningless kind of end of text string. But basically, when you send the prompt, this is our input that is soliciting a response. And the only other one we've utilized is max tokens. And I don't even think this is necessarily necessary for this project, but when I was playing around with it earlier, I found that sometimes if I didn't specify max tokens value, it was sometimes cutting off the blurb halfway. And I suppose I should say what max tokens are. Basically, when ChatGPT responds, is responding with a big string, and that string is broken up into tokens. And tokens are basically combinations of letters. So when you're talking about large language models, they don't work in words. Like when we construct a sentence, we will piece words together and one word after another in order to form a sentence. Large language models, they analyze so much data that they're able to pass all of these different letters into these tokens, and then they piece those tokens together, and that's how they construct a sentence. But this max tokens field here, basically what this does is we're saying how many tokens do we want our response to be at a maximum. So yeah, so in a nutshell, we're referring to this documentation here is telling us what we need to send in the request body in order to get a valid response. And here it's saying what that response is going to be. And this is how we get into response objects. The response isn't just one string. The response is an entire object. And here's what's contained within that object. There's an ID, this object field created. That looks I think that corresponds to a time. That looks like a Unix time. That could be translated into like an hour, minute, second kind of thing. The model is the text DaVinci 3, which is the model that we've utilized. And then choices, within this choices array is another object. And then within that object is the text that we actually end up displaying. So that kind of explains the API endpoint, but how are we actually communicating with that endpoint in practice? Before we get into that, I'm going to explain what this div down here does. So this div displays one of two things. It either displays the completion variable or it displays awaiting response. It's one of those two things. Now, what is the completion variable? To begin with, it's just initialized to an empty string. So right now, this div here is displaying an empty string. You can't see anything, but that's what it's doing. How do we know that? Because we come down here to this class name output, which is this div here, and we're doing something called conditional rendering. So this is basically an if-else statement. It's just the syntax is slightly different. Well, not slightly different, it's a lot different. But what we're effectively saying is if completion equals loading, we're going to display a paragraph tag that says awaiting response. Else, so in any other situation when completion isn't equaling loading, we're displaying the completion. So right now, completion equals an empty string, and so it's displaying an empty string. The only time it ever displays loading is when we hit this create blurb button. And why does it do that? Because when we hit the create blurb button, where are we? Create blurb, we're running the send prompt function. So send prompt here. The first thing we do is we set completion to loading. And the reason we do that is so that we can render this awaiting response. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, send prompt, I want to point out, is an asynchronous function. So what this does is it runs these different commands sequentially. So anytime it sees this await keyword, it's waiting for this command to resolve before it moves on to the next line of code. So what we're saying is we're creating this variable called response, and we're saying send this query and wait for the response. And when we get the response, we'll set it equal to this. And then once we've received that, we can move on to this next line of code, which is to render that out using the completion variable. But suffice it to say, we're using Axios to send a post request to this particular endpoint. This is the body of our request. We're saying model text DaVinci 003 prompt. The prompt that we're sending is the prompt variable. So you'll remember it starts off like that. And then with every subsequent time we hit the submit keyword button, we're adding terms inside of that string. And so then by the time we hit the create blurb button and we run this request, we're saying prompt is equal to write a blurb of a novel that includes the following terms: Harry, Ron, Hermione, for example. So when we send this prompt saying write a blurb of a novel that includes the following terms, blah, 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 that's the same thing as going into the ChatGPT interface and typing in that exact text and hitting enter. We're just doing it via their API. So we're saying the prompt is equal to our prompt variable, and the max tokens, I've set that at 1,000. That's probably way higher than it needs to be, but I've just set that there because I found, like, when I was practicing this earlier, I found that for some reason yielded the best results. So we got that there, and then down here inside of the headers, we're authorizing ourselves using that secret key. And you need to have this bearer here. So you need to have bearer, space, and then your secret key pasted in there. And that's in order to authorize yourself so that they know you're a valid user. Because otherwise a whole bunch of like bots and stuff could just overload the system. So that's the purpose of the authorization. So that's how we send the request. And remember, there are a whole bunch of other things we could put in here. You can refer to the documentation to see all the other like potential fields that you can enter in. For now, we're just going to do that. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to say console.log response. Okay, so now when we hit this button and we get a response back from Axios, we're actually going to be able to visualize that response in the console. So make sure I save that. Come here. Once again, open up the console. And so we're going to say, what can we do this time? We'll do dog, cat, lemonade, stand, and umbrella. I don't know where I plucked these ideas from. So I'm hitting create blurb, okay? It's awaiting response. And now you'll see down here in the console, when we eventually get that response back, we're receiving this object down here. Okay, so let's open that object up. What's in it? There's config, data, headers, request, status. So the status code is 200. That means it's a valid request. We're going to go into the data field. So we open that up. And now we've got this choices array. We open the choices array up, and at the first index of that choices array, there's another object. We open that up, and within that object, we've got this text here that says, when 12-year-old Mary visits her grandmother, and then that's what we're displaying down there. So now looking at this side by side, we're setting the completion to response, which is the variable that we've assigned this object to, .data, so that's data, .choices, that's choices, 0, that's the first index there, .text, and then that's that there. So that's how we're accessing ChatGPT's response and setting it equal to this variable here. And then ultimately, because once we've got that response and we've set it equal to completion, we come down here and completion equals something that isn't loading, therefore it's rendering completion, and therefore it's showing it down the bottom there. I know that seems like a lot. And if you haven't worked with HTTP requests before, if you're not overly familiar with React, I understand that this might have been a difficult tutorial to follow. But if you are familiar with these and if you've used these skills before, then maybe this seems like a lot easier than you expected and a lot simpler. I can say from my point of view, I'm definitely not an experienced coder, but I have been working with React for a little while, and I am sort of familiar with HTTP and Axios. And as someone with my pretty intermediate skill set, this was surprisingly easy. And that's what really amazes me about this, is they've taken this really powerful, sophisticated technology and they've distilled it down into something that's really accessible to the average coder. This is just one possible application of this technology. So down here we're sending the prompt and it's equal to the prompt variable. But let's bypass that entirely, okay? Let's just hard code a string into this. So it's neglecting every other part of the application now. We can write whatever we want. We can say, write a 200-word essay on the history of Antarctic exploration, okay? And we can send that prompt. And now the response that we get is going to be in response to that prompt. And I'm assuming this is going to work. Let's see. I haven't even tried this out yet, but come on. There we go. All right, and so look at that. It has now, in response to our prompt, we asked it to write a 200-word essay on the history of Antarctic exploration, and there we go. Look at that. 200 words, grammatically perfect, very, very factually correct and informative. And so this just demonstrates just how powerful this technology is. And that pretty much concludes the tutorial. So I really hope you've gotten something out of this. I apologize if it was pretty dense and pretty full on. It's, like I said, not the best way to be exposed to some of these concepts. But hopefully you can take these skills, you can run with them, you can start to incorporate OpenAI and ChatGPT into your own applications. And once you do that, like I say, the possibilities are endless. Any text-based prompt you can get, you can solicit any text-based response. Such an exciting technology, a scary technology to be sure, because it's kind of scary that this can happen in a matter of seconds without any human input. That's definitely crossed my mind as well. But if you can harness this, if you can take this powerful tool and you can use it in a creative and positive way, then there's really no limit to what you can achieve as a software developer. So I'm going to leave on that note. I hope you can make the most of this tutorial. If you like it, comment, subscribe, all of that good stuff. And hopefully I'll see you very soon.